Good morning, nerds. While building the Tuberculosis wiki, I've noticed this pattern when I'm looking at people who died before the 1880s. Take Frédéric Chopin, classical piano composer, pride of Poland. You've definitely heard his music, even if you can't name his nocturnes. He's one of the more famous people to have died of TB, which means he shows up in the lead of every "Did you know TB is still a thing?" article. Chopin was thin, pale, and creative, a perfect vision of the Romantic era consumptive. His lover, George Sand, wrote that Chopin coughs with infinite grace, which is certainly not how I've ever coughed. Chopin suffered with these classical TB symptoms for most of his life, was diagnosed with TB in the last year of his life, and then died of TB according to his death certificate. But in the late 20th century, scientists started to question whether he actually had TB based on historical records. They argued that his symptoms and family history lined up more with cystic fibrosis. This caused some controversy as others argued that his cause of death was far more likely to be TB. So they did the obvious thing, and they pulled Chopin's heart out of a wall in a church in Warsaw. Okay, so I know what you're immediately thinking. Dang, they stole Chopin's heart and put it with Einstein's brain. But no, in this case, Chopin actually requested to have his heart returned to Poland after death, so the doctor preserved it in alcohol, and Chopin's sister smuggled it back. It stayed in the Holy Cross Church in Warsaw until World War II, when it was stolen by Nazis and passed between many hands. Eventually, a heart reported to be Chopin's heart returned to the church after the war. It's been there ever since. So, back to 2014, we're in the church in Warsaw, and a bunch of scientists are peering at this heart that's been swimming in a jar of alcohol for the past 160 years. They can see that the heart is enlarged and has nodules, which could be TB or at least a respiratory disease, but that's about as much as you can glean from a heart in a jar. So they ask to open the jar, and of course everybody else in the room is like, heck no, you're not taking a sample of great-great-great-uncle Frederick's heart, get out of here. So, we're never going to be able to prove that Chopin died of TB. We can't go back in time and put his sputum in a PCR, so what's the lesson here? Do we stop using Chopin as an example because we can't prove that he had TB? Or perhaps should we examine why we use Chopin as an example anyway? Often Chopin pops up as this fun fact, TB killed the guy who wrote that piano piece you love, in order to hook people in high-income countries into an article about TB. But why? Why is it easier to pull Americans in with a famous white guy who died 160 years ago than with people who died of TB within the last 10 years, like Shreya Chaprathi? Is it because he's famous or because he's white? There are, of course, more egregious examples of the people diagnosed with TB by listicle. There's Simonetta Vespucci, the model for The Birth of Venus. Often shows up on these lists, but she probably died of a pituitary tumor. Or another model, Elizabeth Siddall, who certainly had the classical symptoms of wasting and pale skin, but she died of an opioid overdose. And then, of course, people who seem to have been copy-pasted from listicle to blog to listicle to blog, often due to lazy reading. Edmond Rostand wrote a play about TB, so his name would show up if you search for TB. Jean-Jacques Rousseau has a name that's similar to Jeannie Rousseau, who got TB while imprisoned in a concentration camp for being a French spy. So, of course, Edmond Rostand and Jean-Jacques Rousseau show up on these articles as TB deaths. John's error in Everything is Tuberculosis is less egregious. He writes that all three Bronte sisters died of TB. It's a commonly reported factoid, and it's close because 3 Bronte siblings did die of TB. But it was Anne, Emily, and their brother Branwell, probably. Charlotte's death was originally reported to be tuberculosis, but later analyses have argued that her death was more likely from pregnancy complications. I don't know why it bothers me so much that Charlotte Bronte is so commonly misreported as having TB. I can't really come up with a reason why diagnosing her death correctly 170 years later really matters, other than the principle of properly cited sources. But what does matter is that people are dying of TB today without ever getting diagnosed with TB. Charlotte Bronte, Frédéric Chopin, Elizabeth Siddall, they all died before we knew TB was a bacterium. They died before you could make a conclusive diagnosis. Now we have all the tools we need to diagnose TB, and they're not exceptionally complicated. Spit in a cup, put in a machine, 2 hours later you know if you have TB and which drugs to use. But 40% of people with TB don't even get that because the tests are too expensive and their governments don't have the resources. And amidst that, the US government is cutting aid budgets, so it's even harder to buy tests. Chopin died in an era where the best they could do is say, looks like you probably have consumption, go sit by the sea and hope for the best. That makes sense to me in a way. Shreya Chaprathi died in an era where we have 2-hour molecular tests and powerful antibiotics, and her doctors still said, looks like you probably have TB. Go wait 3 months for these test results, and then maybe we'll think about getting you antibiotics if you live in the right city. That makes no sense to me. We've got to end TB. Don't forget to be awesome.